Welcome back to Data Architecture Day. Hopefully you had a good break. We are going to pick it right back up with Matt Gordon. So let me switch over to Matt. How are you?
I am doing okay. Hope everybody is well out there and hope your weather is as nice as mine for once. Let me go ahead and show my screen here. Should be seeing PowerPoint now.
Yep.
Cool. Get this flipped over. Should be my full slide.
Yes, and that was fancy. I don't think I've seen anybody do that before, switching the two views.
This thing's really stubborn about which screen it wants to do that on, so I always have to switch it. Should I go ahead and get started? Do we want to wait right until 5:30?
Oh, go for it. We're at
All
5:30
right.
according to my clock.
Very good. Okay, rock and roll then. Well, hopefully this is what you're here to see. If not, you're likely at your own house and you can go do something else and it won't hurt my feelings at all. I really enjoy this talk though. So just to kind of set the story before I get into all of what it is and some stuff about me. As a consultant, I've been fortunate enough to go to a lot of places, see a lot of high availability setups. When I was a DBA prior to getting into that, I set up a lot of this stuff and did some of it pretty well and some of it not very well at all. But what always surprised me is when I would go to clients and they weren't aware of kind of everything you could do, even with just SQL Server on-prem. So I created this talk as basically a way to kind of quickly show you all of your options for all of this stuff. Because I would go to some place and they're like, yeah, we're running always on AGs. And I talked to them about why. I said, well, why did you pick that over log shipping? And they would look at me like, I've never heard of log shipping. I don't know what it is. So this is kind of a crash course for all that stuff, on-prem, hybrid, and then solely cloud-based. So hope it helps. This is a little bit about me. So I'm an architect for Insight DI. I'm not a salesperson, but I will say if any of this sounds cool and you're like, oh, we'd really like to set this up, but we really don't have the people or the bandwidth or whatever to do it, that's my email address. Feel free to reach out. We've got a really good group and we could help with that. But also feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about this, feedback. If you think the talk was amazing, definitely tweet that. If you think it's terrible, just email me that. Please don't tweet that. But really, either way, I want you to connect however is comfortable for you. So yeah, there's my email there. I am SQL at Speed, basically everywhere online, Twitter, GitHub, blog is SQLatspeed.com. There we go. So this slide's not too exciting. It's just more stuff about me. But one thing I did want to point out towards the bottom is I'm the leader of the Lexington Pass local group. So this isn't necessarily an ad for Pass, but I will kind of get on my soapbox here on general Microsoft data platform community stuff. The fact that you're here on a Saturday night is awesome. It means you're taking a little bit of time trying to get better, learn some things you don't know, and just kind of expand your network, all of those things. Whether it's an event like this or past local groups or whatever, they survive off volunteers. You don't have to be a speaker. You can volunteer to moderate. Virtual events are a little bit different, but there's a lot of ways that you can dive in and help. And the worst case by getting involved with this is you're probably going to learn some stuff you didn't know. The best case is you're going to learn things you didn't know. You're going to make friends you didn't have, and that may lead to a job that you otherwise wouldn't have. That's certainly been my story. So the fact that you're here is awesome, and definitely stick with it, please. Okay, so I said I'm SQL at Speed everywhere, and that's really just an excuse to show this slide. So if data platform's not your thing, you don't like the session, whatever, that's fine. I love to talk about car racing. There's obviously not been any of that really happening so far this year, though I think that's starting to change. But if you're interested in talking to me about this, the only thing I like talking more about than data is this. And I occasionally get to drive these cars, so that's pretty fun. But enough about me. So here's our agenda for the day. I'm going to set the stage up front. We'll dive into the tech stuff quickly, but there's some terms and things that I want us all to kind of have the same understanding of as we move forward through the session. So we're going to talk about what high availability is and a little bit about what it's not. We're going to talk about setting high availability goals and how that happens, because that's going to dictate what the solution is to some extent. You may come up with something really cool, but it may not meet a budget goal or an uptime goal or something like that. So we'll kind of set the stage for those two things, and then we'll dive into the deep tech stuff. So we'll talk about HA options in SQL Server on-prem. That will go quickly. One thing tricky about doing this as a webinar is generally I like to try to get a lot of feedback about what folks have heard of, what they haven't. That's a pretty cumbersome thing to do in this way. So what I'll do is I'll kind of bounce through that, assuming we have kind of a basic level of familiarity with most of it. And if not, then I'll take questions a couple times in there and we can chat more deeply about that. Once we go through there, I'll talk about kind of hybrid HA, which is something you're starting to see more and more of. You've got your servers and they're at a data center somewhere. You've got an Azure footprint as well. And how can we leverage both of those things where if our data center goes down, we don't lose everything, we still stay up. And then I'm going to wrap up with some options for high availability in Azure-Only. And then we can end with just kind of some things I want you to take away from the talk and any additional questions and answers that you may have, though I'll be happy to take those basically anywhere. I believe you can put those in the chat and then Kevin can relay those to me. So let's dive into it. So what is high availability? So the best, kind of most succinct official definition that I could find is that it refers to systems that are durable, and this next part is key, and likely to operate continuously. So what this doesn't mean is it's never going to go down. What it means is we're working towards that goal, and then budget and some other things are going to either help us or hurt us there. But it's not a requirement. High availability doesn't mean zero downtime. That can depend on a lot of factors, and we'll talk over the next few slides about what those are. But it just means basically if there is downtime, as the next part of the slide says, we're going to try to minimize that. That's kind of job A. Job B is, depending on the costs involved and maintenance needed and all that, there is likely to be necessary downtime for the systems that most of us work on. And so then our job is to minimize the impact of that through where it's scheduled, through how efficient it is, those sorts of things. So end of the day, you're probably not going to be up 100% of the time, but I'm going to give you ways that we can get really, really close. And much like racing, it really depends to a large extent how much money you want to / can spend. You can get really close to zero downtime, but it costs a lot of money. I can get really close to the front of the racing pack. It costs a fair amount of money, which is why I'm not there. And that's kind of the same thing here. But we'll talk about how you can get there, and also mention a couple things, kind of ways to argue that with managers, and just kind of set those terms. So how do we set these goals? These goals cannot be set in a vacuum. And what I mean by that is this. It's not the job of one team to say, okay, our downtime is this. This has got to be a collaborative effort, often across teams. And even, where I had been before I got into consulting, though we supported a lot of 24/7, 365 environments, our actual headcount in that realm was pretty small. There was not a lot of us, but even that at a small to medium sized place, we had to deal with a number of teams. So as you scale that out to larger firms, that certainly doesn't change. You need to speak to operations, especially when we talk about things like always on availability groups and things like that. They're helping support a solution that part of it belongs to both groups. And so talking to them is really important. It's not a fiefdom where like, well, the database is down. That's the database people's job. With some of the more advanced solutions we'll talk about over the next hour or so, they are a key part of that. When we set those goals, it's not just a technical thing either. It's not like, well, we have the technology and we have the people to support whatever. It's also, what does the customer need? So you're going to have to talk to customer-facing teams, usually sales folks or customer support or something like that. And what's most important is oftentimes they're not going to come to you. And that's where, if you're fortunate enough to be in kind of a leadership spot for your group, it's worth it to try to rattle somebody's cage a little bit and say, listen, we need to be a part of this. You can't just go to the customer and say, oh yeah, sure, we can be down only 5 minutes for the whole year. It's fine. We've got really good people. They need to understand basically what they're signing you up for, what the budget needs are going to be for that. And if they're not going to come to you, you kind of need to go to them and say, listen, we need to be a part of this, but do it in a friendly way. You don't want to accost them and be like, we need to be a part of this, but you do need to be a part of it. You just want to get that across in a really nice way. And if you'd like some advice for how to do that, feel free to touch base with me offline and we can kind of chat about some things that have worked for me. It's a tricky situation. Last point there is there can be contract personnel here as well. So it's not just customer facing people. I've worked in environments where the customer facing people had great respect for the technical folks, didn't sign us up for anything without talking to us. But depending on the nature of what you were doing and what industry you work in and all that, there may be contract personnel that are actually negotiating this out, and they may not talk to anybody. They may just be like, yeah, that seems fine. It's good to try to inject yourself into that dialogue as well. And if that dialogue's not going to happen, try to make it happen. Because ultimately, you're all in that same boat. It's not just the tech folks. It's not just the sales folks. Everybody's going to have egg on their face if you don't meet the goals that you are assigned to. And the reason I have the second part of the slide here is SLAs, which is basically what we're talking about in that top half, are really important. I've worked on systems where we were fined $1,000 a minute of unexpected downtime. That's real money. And that's the kind of thing, if you have some sort of an outage and you've gone over whatever the agreed up or downtime is, and you've got a 2-hour outage, you're looking at possibly $120,000. That's somebody's salary. So that can have, it's not just, oh, we had this rough downtime thing and we feel bad. That can really have an impact on somebody's life. So it's important before you get into the tech stuff to make sure you're setting expectations for all of these groups and interfacing with all of these groups as much as you possibly can, because it's really going to help you down the road. So you notice I touched lightly on customer needs there. And that's because most customers, they're not going to have the technical understanding that we do. They're just going to be like, well, it should never go down. I'm paying X amount of money. It should never break. Fair. If I was them, I would say the same thing. But that's where it's incumbent on us to understand the industry we're in, the business we're in, and set expectations both to customers if we get to talk to them, or to internal folks who may get to talk to them about what that means. Here's how much it costs to implement it. Here's how much it costs to support that going forward. And that's going to come down to us. So it's hard. I always kind of wanted to sit back and not get involved with that stuff. And I've got stories from early on in my time in charge of that kind of a data center where that was really the wrong move. So we need to be a part of these discussions, even though they can be uncomfortable, and even though some folks may not want to send them, we kind of have to, and it's going to be best for everybody. Because it's not only a software thing. We've talked for about 10 minutes here. We've only lightly touched on software. So the software decision is important, whether we choose always on AGs or log shipping, or we do something up in Azure or whatever. That's important, but it's not just picking the cool thing that we can go tell our friends, hey, we set up this cool thing. You want to make sure that any tools, any tech that you pick is supportable by your team. So the best technical call may not be the best call, because you're not trying to win a beauty contest with what you're setting up. You're trying to make sure that you meet the uptime goals that you've been handed, and you want to make sure that if you're on vacation, that the team can handle that as well. So the shiniest, coolest thing, but you're the only one that understands how it works, probably not the right call. You probably want to back off of that and either give the team what they need to get to your level on that particular solution, or implement something easier that they're going to be able to help you with. Beyond that, the process is really, really important. They should be written down. I was not always great about that. Nobody is, but it's important. They should be written down. They should be testable. That is critical, and it's hard, especially for some of these more complicated setups. A lot of times getting the budget to get that number of servers and all that hardware you need to kind of make that go. Even if you're doing it in Azure, it's not free, but it's really important, because that's the difference between your manager coming to you and saying, okay, we need to do X, Y, and Z, and you say, well, I'm going to have to fail this group over and run this script and do that. And then they say, how long does it take? If you say, I don't know, they're going to think that's your fault. If you say, well, I know, the only way you can really confidently do that is to have tested that process before and say, when I ran this in test, which is not prod, but it's close, it took 20 minutes. And this is something you can schedule and plan and all that. If they don't give you a test environment to test these things, then they cannot really insist on you answering questions. What's the impact? How long will it take? You don't know. And it's important for you to be honest about that and say that up front. So I don't have an environment to test this with. I don't know. My best guess is that. The nice thing is, if you have access to Azure, some of this stuff can be set up and tested for a brief time and then torn back down. Doesn't solve everything, but going back to what I mentioned on the last slide, there are kind of some tips and tricks depending on your role and kind of the nature of your boss that have helped me over the years. So if that's an argument you're currently in, or one that you're about to start, definitely touch base with me and we can chat offline about some ways to kind of improve your spot. Last but not least, personnel are really important. Like I said, if you're really good and what you designed and set up is really good, that's awesome. If you didn't bring the rest of the team with you, and it's a lot of junior folks that aren't up to speed on any of what you set up, and you're kind of lording that over them as like, well, I know how to do this and you guys don't, and that's why I'm the team lead, or that's why I'm this. That's maybe fine for you, but doesn't help the team, and ultimately doesn't help you, because inevitably whatever is set up is going to break sometime when you're not there. And whether it's somebody on a team with you or some third party overnight folks or offshore folks or whatever, this is going to bite you. So personnel are important, and it's not just the talent aspect. You want smart people working with you, but training is key. The nice thing about now is that there are so many opportunities to get free or very low cost training that it's not the decision anymore. Like, well, I want to send them off to this 5-day always on class, but that's going to cost $5,000. And current situation aside, where we really can't go anywhere, that was a substantial investment. You can get a lot of that through other means now, and whether that's going to a SQL Saturday, going to something like this, attending a pre-con at a SQL Saturday, or even going to Pass Summit, there are lower cost ways than kind of that traditional like book or on-site training model. And though there's a lot of really bad things about what's going on right now. One of the really good things is virtual training and information and things like that is even easier to come by than it was. Any questions about any of that before we dive into the HA options on-prem?
No questions so far, but if you do have any, drop them in chat. I'll make sure that they get over to Matt.
Okay, cool. All right, so let's have a look at what these are. And like I said, I'm going to assume that we're all kind of at least basically familiar with these. If there's one you feel like I go through too fast, that's fine. Drop that question in chat and I'll handle it kind of at the end of this section. These slides are largely for reference. So you're going to see an architectural diagram like on this one that's basically Microsoft's depiction of how this works. That's on every slide. I'm not going to go through that bit by bit. I'm happy to do it at the end of the session. But just to kind of get through these right now, I kind of want us to know everything we're talking about, and then we'll dive into kind of the more shiny, cool stuff. So this is tried and true. Replication's no fun. It's not sexy. It works, and it does solve a lot of problems, and it is arguably the first high availability thing for SQL. What does it do? It copies data and database objects. What are some usage scenarios for it? So here's the three that I've seen most often is it is a way to keep really painful queries off of primary. You can replicate data to a reporting server and tell the Power BI folks or whatever, like, hey, point at this, query this. It doesn't matter if you beat this thing up a bit because the primary server's over here doing what it needs to do. This works a lot better if they don't need the data to be absolutely real time. You can get replication down within a few seconds, depending on what you're doing, but that's, especially these days, arguably not at all real time. Another one I've seen is you've got another office somewhere, and it's maybe their internet is not the best. They have some processes that they need to handle, billing or something like that, and really they just need to get the data at some point during the day, do their thing, and then upload whatever their thing is. Replication can be a good way to do that, and it's not at all real time, and it's kind of, maybe it's okay if it fails because their internet was down or slow or bad or something like that. Eventually during that day, they're going to get the data they need, and then they can work, and they don't have to constantly try to reach outside to get data from somewhere else. They have the information they need. The third one, I never used to see this until a few years ago, but it seems like replication's kind of made a comeback the last few years, and that is where you've got usually a pretty intense OLTP environment, and you want to kick off some ETL from that, and maybe you don't have the latest and greatest hardware, and maybe you don't even have the latest version of SQL where they've kind of helped us with workloads where we can kind of do both. But you need that data out of there, and you need it to be ETL'd somewhere else so other things can happen to it. Replication is an interesting way to do that. And then you can make data accessible across your org, again, without really slowing down your main server. What are some pros and cons here? So pros and cons are, you've got a GUI that you can manage and monitor and do all that. It really hasn't changed in a long time, but it's effective. It does what it does. It's not cool to look at, but it's fine. You can do this on any versions, so you don't need enterprise. You don't have to drop a bunch of cache. You can control the frequency and amount, but bear in mind that can have performance impacts as well, which brings us to the cons. That's actually the middle point down there. You can filter this stuff, and there's some dials you can change to only replicate at certain times and all that, but the performance may not be exactly what you're looking for out of that. There's no automatic failover here, and administering a database with complicated replication setup, the admin effort, I'll just say it's painful. Oftentimes you end up needing scripts to kind of tear everything down you did. If there's some sort of a schema update or something like that, it's pretty annoying. But it is the first thing that allowed us to make data highly available because we could put it somewhere else. So if the main server went down, we've got this somewhere else. So let's talk about log shipping. To be honest, this is my favorite. I think this is underrated. It's pretty easy to set up. There's not much to it. It doesn't cost anything extra. It's pretty effective. It's not real time, but when we get into real time, we're also talking about real cache too. So this is something you can do that's going to give you a lot of what you need, especially if you're in a kind of low to mid budget range. And there's not a whole lot to it. So it consists of 3 steps. It takes a log backup. It then sends it to one or more secondaries, and then it restores that on those, and done. You can set up a monitor server. If you do set this up, I would definitely recommend doing that. It is optional, you don't need it, but this gives you a really easy way to go back and look at the history of every job. Did the backup run? Was it sent? Was it restored? All those things. You can look at all that independently, but the monitor server kind of gives you a one-stop shop where you just go and say, oh yeah, that job didn't run yesterday and I need to go find out why. Instead of having to look at 1, 2, or 3 or more servers trying to figure out why that is. This is how it runs. So you can see there, pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of moving parts here. So what are our pros? So replication can be database wide, but you have to specify it object by object underneath. This is just database wide. It does give us possible read-only access to secondaries. We can set the delay between the backup and restore. There's certain use cases where you might want to do that, and it's a little bit easier to do than some of the stuff we just talked about. What are the cons? It is manual failover only. The secondary data is only available when the replica is in standby. In other words, when you're restoring the log backup, people are not able to read the data. So I talked about setting expectations up front. I'll talk about it again at the end, and I'll talk about it here now. If you go to a user and you say, okay, I've set this thing up, and you can go to the secondary and you can read data, and it's always going to be there. If you set up log shipping, please don't say that, because it will always be there, but there will be points during the day where for a few seconds, they're not going to be able to read it. And I've been in environments where we set this up and we had to talk about setting expectations and all that, and they weren't accurately set. And then we ended up having to take some of it down because some very important user was really bothered by the fact that they ran a query and it failed. And they thought basically that the team had done a bad job and that the setup was a bad thing and this wasn't a solution, and they made them tear it all down. So please don't be that team. One other con I want to touch on before we move to the next thing is this is the only one that tends to make Windows admins a little bit mad, and your security folks as well. The permissions required because the files really are being copied through the network. Some security admins get really nervous about that. I don't think it's a security hazard, but obviously their opinions may differ, so don't be surprised if that happens. And that's a good conversation to be ready for if log shipping is something that you want to set up, especially if you're setting up log shipping to a machine out to Azure. Mirroring, I'm going to talk about this briefly. So this was deprecated in 2012. It still exists, even in 2019. Please avoid this feature for anything new you're setting up. I'm going to talk about it because it's still there, but we're not going to spend much time on it. Microsoft doesn't want you to use this, but in this kind of brave new Microsoft world, things they deprecate don't go away. They just don't do anything with them. It works, very similarly to log shipping, like we just talked about, except it's not taking transaction log backups. It's really taking blocks of the log and then shipping those, mirroring those, whatever terminology you would want. You can set up a witness server to give yourself automatic failover. What are scenarios that you might want to see this? If you absolutely require automatic failover, but always on availability groups or always on failover cluster instances are not feasible, then you could use this, but think long and hard about why you'd want to do that. There is a high safety mode, which is the first kind of dial we have to turn to minimize the possibility for data loss. And if you're supporting SQL Server 2005 or 2008, I hope you're not, because they're out of support, but the reality is some of us probably are. So mirroring does exist. In case you've kind of came to the game late and didn't know about this, this is an option for you, but please don't use it. Always on AGs. So what these are containers, and not in the sense you're hearing containers now. It's just basically groups of databases that can fail over together. It's not always on by itself. What it really is database mirroring plus. So it does a lot of those same things. So it does package up bits of the log and send those over instead of taking an entire log backup and shipping that everywhere. It works a lot like mirroring. Even some of the error messages, even in 2019, still talk about replicas as mirrors, which is not correct. But you can see where this technology built off that. So what are some of the features here? This is the first thing we've talked about where we have a multi-database failover. It also is a little more secure than some of the things we've talked about because encryption's built in. As those log blocks fly across the wire, they are not in the clear. And there's built-in compression as well. From SQL Server 2016 forward, this all got a lot better too. And this is not an always-on talk, but yeah, from 2016 forward, the experience here got really good. And speaking as somebody who set these up when they came out on SQL Server 2012, it got a lot better. It was a little rough at the start. Another kind of cool feature we've got here is these have automatic page. And so what that does is if a page on one of the replicas has an issue and there's corruption somehow, probably a storage issue, but somehow it will call out and say, hey, I know that there's other nodes out here that you have this page. My copy of this page is hosed. I need yours. And that all happens under the covers. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to approve anything. There is a DMV that you can go look at to see if that's happening. I strongly recommend monitoring that if you have this set up, because if automatic page repair is happening a lot, it's not necessarily something that's going to be reported in the log and all of that, but it's something you want to know about because it probably points you to some sort of a storage issue or something like that, and something you're going to want to get on top of in case it gets worse and more widespread, and it's not something that the group can actually fix itself. This also gives us the ability to move data synchronously or async, which is nice. So this is the first thing we've talked about that you can, I would say, fairly reliably say is real time on a replica, because you can set it up in synchronous mode and it won't commit anywhere until it commits everywhere, more or less. You can have 8 total secondaries, 3 synchronous replicas allowed, 2016 and later. So what are some of the quick pros and cons here? So pros, you can fail over groups. You can have those flexible failover policies. You can set thresholds for certain things. So even with automatic failover, it doesn't necessarily have a mind of its own. You can kind of set guidelines for how many times something has to fail or how long things have to take or whatever. It does also give us basic load balancing in 2016 and later as well. So it's kind of a round robin thing. Let's say you've got 4 secondaries. It will just go through the list, 1, 2, 3, 4, and kind of cycle through those. So it's a way to use all the hardware you have, which makes managers very happy because they don't like things sitting around not doing stuff. So if you have this, you can say, listen, everything you're paying for, yes, we're using it because the load is balanced across all of these things. Another thing it has is database level health detection. So everything we've talked about so far is in groups. And, if one database in the group fails over, kind of they all go. But one thing it didn't used to have is that if one database in the group had an issue and you didn't have a failover policy kind of specifically set for this, you could have a database in the group go suspect. And if you weren't specifically monitoring for that, you wouldn't know. And the availability group wouldn't take any action at all. But in 2016 and later, you can basically say, listen, every time one of us has a problem, fail the entire group over so you can look at it. And that's a nice feature we didn't have. What are the cons here? It relies on a Windows Server failover cluster underneath. So we have to talk to our Windows ops. That adds a layer of complication in design and setup and all those sorts of things. It does increase the load on your network infrastructure quite a bit as well. If you're setting this up for what's likely to be a high traffic environment, you're moving a lot of data around, the network's getting a lot more use than it used to, and that's a good thing to chat with your network folks about. It also requires Enterprise Edition, so that's some serious cash. Basic availability groups don't. I'll talk about those briefly, but in my opinion, they're not well named because they're like 5% of this, but they're called mostly the same thing. Another con here is because you're using your network so much more, another thing you need to realize is things like index rebuilds, reorganizations, things like that have a significant impact, because when anything you're doing that generates transaction log traffic has to go everywhere. Every replica you have set up has to get those blocks, harden those, and then bring those into their log. So your maintenance procedures and scheduling likely have to change. And I have whole sessions that I do on that. So if you have things you want to ask about that and we run out of time, we can chat offline. There are some cons. It's a lot more work, but it does help you get a lot closer to a really robust uptime goal. A couple slides ago, I talked about always on FCIs. Here's the slide for that. I don't see these a lot. They do still exist. The unit of failover for the first and only time in what we've talked about here is the SQL Server instance itself. So this is not, well, these two databases are in a group, and if one of them has a problem, I want to fail it over. There's some sort of issue, the whole instance fails over. So it's a modernized version of kind of the traditional two-node cluster that some of us might have known 8, 10, 12 years ago. It requires shared storage, which makes it kind of less popular than anything that we've just talked about. That's a lot harder to do. Like I said, you don't see these a lot. Any specific questions about these, happy to handle. But yeah, this is not something widely seen. So we'll get into some, now we're going to get into kind of what our options are and what the scenarios are that I've seen. Now that we know everything we can do on-prem, as we extend this out into the cloud, how can we do that and why? Any questions yet?
Excuse me, had a couple of comments. One of them was that log shipping breaks when you have more than 700 databases on a server.
I had not personally tested that, but it doesn't surprise me. I'd love to know how that was found out, but I have an idea.
Yep. I guess he had to end up writing his own code for it.
Oh, good.
The other piece was when you were on the availability group slide with WSFC,
Yeah,
you can do availability groups without WSFC in most recent versions of SQL Server.
that is absolutely true. Yeah, that's a tricky thing, because I don't want to go too far down the rabbit holes with AGs, even though I'm fond of them. But yeah, you could do technically clusterless, I think, as of 2017.
Yeah.
I would say there's a debate where if you take the cluster out from under an availability group, you're technically supposed to call it a read scale. And certain folks, and I think I'm one of those folks, would argue that it's not really highly available at that point in time, because there's kind of nothing holding it up. Like, you've scaled your reads, but if you have some sort of a database issue, there's not a cluster kind of keeping you safe. But
True,
yes,
true.
that is true. And that's, I think we're going to see that more and more, less reliance on a cluster for these. But yeah, I've got a whole talk where I kind of go nerdy on that. Was it just those two?
Yep, that's it so far.
Okay. All right. We'll dive back into it here. So when I built this section, what I'm hoping for is that there are folks in this audience, as there are in most, that either it's a personal goal or it's a goal from their boss or there's a bonus tied to it or something like that, said, hey, we need to get some stuff into the cloud this year. So I'm going to tell you kind of here's the bridge to get there without diving in with both feet. So here's the most common one that I see. Again, it's tried and true. It's not shiny and new, but you can set up replication to a VM in Azure. It's really no different as long as the SQL Server you're using on-prem can see the one in Azure. It's not different. So, and this is a true story. I actually went somewhere as a consultant where one of the members of the DBA team was given a task with a bonus tied to it for, if you could get some data from this server out into Azure, you got money. It was that simple. And so I was there doing other things, but I had known him. It was a place I had gone several times. And he's like, hey, what's the easiest way for me to get this data out in Azure so I can get my bonus? And I said this, because they already had a footprint. And so any of what I talk about here, if you're in a corporate environment, you're going to want to make sure that that there's something out in Azure and the networking folks have kind of paved the way for you. You need to make sure that basically the corporate network extends out there in some form or fashion. If you're at home, then all that kind of goes out the window because we can set all that up ourselves with point-to-site VPNs and all that. But if you're playing around at work and doing this for work, you'll have to talk to the network folks and make sure there's stuff out in Azure and they've got gateways and things like that for you to get there. But if that's all set up, this is easy and you can kind of check that box like, yep, I've got a VM out in Azure. I replicated some data out there. Job done. That's not a lot of fun though. So here's something that I think is pretty interesting and also not well known is Azure SQL database can actually be a replication subscriber. So if you're using replication actively now and you're kind of looking like, well, listen, what's the gateway for me to get this data out in the cloud where then I can do some other things to it and kind of pave the path to start moving more and more things out there where eventually that data just lives out there. This can be a great way to do it. So it's a great way to ease you and your team into both cloud comfort, and it's the first time we're talking here about a platform as a service offering. So if you've not been exposed to that, this is kind of a really easy way to be like, okay, I have an Azure SQL database out there. I have some data into it, and I'm going to go play with it and learn what that means and kind of learn what its settings are and all that. This is a pretty straightforward setup. The demo of it is quite dry, so I don't do it here, especially in an hour. If this is a setup you'd like to see, I do have screenshots of the demo. I did at Past Summit a couple years ago, and I'd be happy to send those to you. There's a couple gotchas on the screen. So the setup is straightforward, but there's like one box you check and one character you change. So it's not quite as straightforward as traditional replication, but it's 99% as easy. So if this is something you want to play with, let me know and I can send that stuff out to you afterwards. Log shipping, like I said, I think it's underrated. I think it's cool. It's easy to use. It's cheap. So you should not be shocked that it's popped back up in here as we start talking about taking our SQL Server HA stuff and extending that out into Azure. So if you want a copy of data stored completely offsite, for instance, if you have a customer or a potential client that says, listen, we don't sign contracts with anybody that don't store data off site somewhere, this is a way to get to that. And you can just log ship out there and say, yep, we have a copy of that out there, and you can go look at it. Again, the setup's straightforward. In a corporate environment, if you've got anything out in Azure at all, and your networking folks have already laid that groundwork, then it's not much different than anything you've ever done on-prem. And it does give you can expand the environment you have, and you don't need a cluster. You don't need anything else underneath that. So again, these first 3 slides are kind of pretty easy. It's stuff hopefully we've done on-prem, or we've at least seen, and it's ways to get that out into Azure, and then the doors are kind of flung wide open. Once it's out there, it's a lot easier to get into some harder stuff. So let's talk about that harder stuff. You can extend always-on AGs that you're running at your sites into Azure. And I actually have a quick story about this. Customer I went to once was out there, just wasn't doing it. I had been there working on their always-on AGs in the past, but hadn't touched them for months. Was out there doing some performance tuning and some other stuff. And they were kind of down to the end of working out what was going to be a pretty significant contract for them, and had come to a stopping point. And the stopping point was this: they had a primary and a backup, and those were about 85 miles apart from each other on either side of a river that's known to flood. Not all the time, but sometimes. And so from a HA and DR perspective, that's really bad. And their potential customer was refusing to sign the deal because as part of kind of the end of the process, they had asked about all these sorts of things, and they had a requirement that anybody that they signed a contract with had to have backup data at least 350 miles apart from wherever the other backups were. And so they kind of came to me, and they had AG set up for all kinds of stuff, and the team knew it well, comfortable with it. Said, hey, what can we do quickly? It's very difficult for us to go find a third data center, in like a week or two to get this deal signed. So what we ended up doing, and they already had other things out in Azure. It's actually the same place, the story I mentioned, where the guy came to me and said, listen, I need this bonus. What's the easiest way for me to get it? Same group a couple years on. We extended their AGs that had been on-prem up until now, and extended those out into Azure. Now, again, like anything with AGs, we had to involve the networking group and the Windows group as well, because you're extending the cluster out there more or less, and that's not 100% simple. But it is a way to kind of solve that thing, especially, and I see this more and more, where clients won't sign deals with you if your data only lives one place, which is bad for a whole bunch of reasons. But they also will say, well, listen, it needs to be 300 miles apart, 500 or 1,000 or whatever, because with the cloud, it's pretty easy for us to do that. So this is an easy way to kind of meet that threshold as well. You'll notice I didn't talk about mirroring at all. So everything where I kind of said, all right, we're going to bring what we talked about on-prem, we're going to bring it forward. I didn't talk about mirroring here because we're not supposed to be using it. And I'll just kind of leave that there. Any questions from that section before we get into Azure-only HA options?
No questions so far.
Okay, cool. So these are, as the slide says, you implement these in Azure only. I would recommend at least kind of knowing what the portal is and how to build something. It doesn't have to be any of the things I'm about to talk about, but have the ability to log into the portal, know how you can add a resource and kind of browse those before you dive into the deep end with some of these things. And there's a lot of resources out there that kind of make that bridge easy. So let's talk about some things we can do. I talk to more and more clients of mine where maybe a year or two ago it was, hey, we need to get some data out in Azure. We have part of a data center we're trying to sunset or whatever, and we want to move that stuff, but we're going to leave the rest of it where it is. Those conversations are now turning into, listen, we have a 24-month plan to get everything out in Azure. How can we get there? And so this is kind of what the end game of some of that looks like now. And of course, these are things that are changing all the time, because there's newer and cooler stuff we can do. So let's dive into those. So we can set up an always-on AG in Azure only. It does, in theory, require a domain controller to support the Windows Server failover cluster, but as was noted earlier, once you get beyond SQL Server 2016, this was kind of as politically correct as I could put it, that lessens the need for cluster support underneath. And we don't need to go, argue about read scale and all that. But in theory, to build what most would consider a highly available always-on AG, we're going to need a domain controller out in Azure as well. The cool thing about this is, and I've got the link on the next slide, there is a template out in Azure that will build this for you. So if these slides, if your eyes are kind of glazed over by now and you're like, well, I don't remember everything Matt said about all the stuff that this has that an on-premises AG doesn't have, you can go build one. You can use that link there. Forewarn you, the name is terrible. It's called Always On Cluster, which is not technically incorrect, but really what you're building is an always-on availability group. The cluster is a necessity underneath it. The name is really confusing. So yeah, if you see, and that's why I put the link there, because depending on kind of what mood Azure Search is in, if you put always on, you may or may not find it. That link is going to take you right there. I believe it still builds it on SQL Server 2016. Hopefully they're working on a more modern version of it, but it at least gives you a flavor of the components that are different from something on-prem. So if you're going to do this, make sure that the cluster nodes are placed in what's called an availability set. And what that does is more or less ensure that the resources within that set are isolated from each other in the physical data center. So they're not like next to each other in the rack or something like that. This is going to build a VNet for you as well. It's going to build what's called an internal load balancer, or ILB. That's required if you're using a listener. If you're not using a listener, you should. Don't have time to go into that, but you just should. Like I said, there's the link to build one. So if you're like, I want to see what 100% Azure always on AG looks like, click that link, give yourself 30 to 60 minutes, and you've got one. And you can see where it has all this, where your on-prem one does not. So that's AGs. How do FCIs look up there when we do them in Azure? So if you go to the Microsoft documentation, it will officially say, here are 3 different ways to do it. You've got a 2-node FCI using Azure VMs with attached storage, Windows 2016 storage spaces direct or S2D for virtual SAN. It'll also say 2-node FCI using Azure VMs and something like SIOS data keeper, and it lastly will say 2-node FCI with Azure VMs with a remote iSCSI target, blah, 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 blah. It will officially say all of those are fine. It's wrong. Please don't do the first one. S2D is not recommended in Azure, and that's purely a performance reason. And it goes back to the first point on this slide, is just like on-prem, an FCI in Azure is going to require shared storage. Well, think about why you're doing that. If you're moving things to the cloud, you want to take advantage of the abilities that are native there, especially with platform as a service stuff and things like that, where a lot of this highly available stuff is built in. And we'll get into that over these next few slides. It's frustrating when I go to talk to somebody and they're like, I want exactly what I have on-prem that I built 4 years ago up in Azure. Think long and hard about why you're doing that. Lift and shift is fine, and it's certainly comfortable. It's probably not the best from a performance angle. It's definitely not the best from a cost angle. VMs are not cheap, and platform as a service stuff configured properly is almost definitely going to save you money in a lot of circumstances. So I have these last 2 slides. So for the folks with FCIs, they kind of understand, yeah, I can go build what I have and I can do it in Azure and it's possible. I would use SIOS for that. But I also, to take you into this last section here, want you to think about that. If you bring in a consultant or it's something you're doing internally and like, listen, we're going to plan our migration to the cloud, take advantage of what's out there. So let's talk about what some of the stuff is out there that's pretty cool, that's going to do a lot of the work for us. Everything we've just talked about, a lot of it kind of happens auto-magically now. So Azure SQL Database, the knock on it was for quite a while that the T-SQL support wasn't there. That's certainly not been true, I would say, for the last couple of years. The reality is, if you're waiting on the box product to come out, a lot of those bits have been running in Azure for months. So this is a good way to stay kind of right on that curve. There are still two gotchas that I want to call out here. You still can't do cross-database queries with 3 or 4 part names. So if you're migrating legacy databases, most likely that support kind of an older app that have those kinds of things in there, Azure SQL Database, not for you. You're going to have to rewrite that. You also have a lack of SQL Server Agent that we all know and might love. You do have things called Elastic Database Jobs that largely replace that. So you can get that functionality back, but you don't have agent in the form that you know. Here's the cool stuff. So even on the basic tier, so this is kind of an Azure SQL Database doesn't break down as simply as I'm trying to do it here, but I would regard basic, standard, and GP service tiers as kind of your first 3, arguably like entry level-ish. They separate compute and storage and give you 4 nines. That's pretty hard to pull off on-prem, even with any of the stuff we talked about. And you've got that out of the box, even on the lowest tier. So that's something to think about, especially as we just came out of talking about engineering these really complicated HA setups. Do we need to do that? Can we just put it on Azure SQL DB and kind of let the work Microsoft's already done do that for us? Then as you go up into the more expensive tiers, you still get the 4 nines that I just talked about. You also get compute and storage co-located with each other, so you're getting, additional performance that you didn't have. But underpinning all of that, as you get into those higher tiers, is there's basically an always-on AG underneath that stuff, and you didn't have to set it up. You didn't have to worry about a load balancer or a cluster or a listener or any of that. It's there, and it's giving you all that functionality, and you don't have to set it up. You don't have to maintain it, things like that. Pretty cool. One thing I do want to call out before I move on from this slide is that the lower tiers I talked about, you may experience slight performance, not issues. You're going to see some slowness during certain maintenance times. If you want to work around that, then you go to premium, you go to BC, something like that. Those higher tiers, you're not going to see that, but the lower tiers cost a lot less, and there's a reason for that. The experience, while still very good, is not perfect, but it's really good. So, like I said, you've got high availability built in. It's under the covers, and the way it manifests itself is a little bit different depending on the tier you're in, but it's there. You can set something called failover groups. So basically, that's like an availability group. You don't have to set up anything else. You're just telling a group of Azure SQL databases, hey, you need to fail over together. Like, you are operating as a group, but that's kind of the only mechanics that you have to set up. That goes for Azure SQL Database single or managed instance as well, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. You can also replicate these all over the world. So like I can think of a client that I went 2 years ago. They were really proud, and justifiably so, of this awesome sharding solution they had built with SQL Server using CDC and some, I think, C# code, and it was really cool. They don't have to do it anymore. This is, you just flip a switch. Now you certainly have to have the budget to back that up, but you can just flip a switch and say, I want this replicated to a couple other spots. And as long as you're willing to pay for that, it happens. You didn't have to create anything. Just like any of the rest of this, understand your budget, understand the issues you might be having to work around, to know how to kind of choose certain things. But there's a lot of options out here. We don't have to build anything. two other quick things that I want to touch on that are Azure only. So Azure SQL Database is quite the family now. So what we just talked about largely was single databases. You also have, and so what MIs do is it's still a platform as a service offering. So you've got automatic patching, version updates, backups, HA, all those things. You're getting the equivalent of an on-prem enterprise edition set up in the cloud that you don't have to patch and you don't have to do that stuff. Microsoft does provide some tooling to kind of lift and shift your way up there. DMS is one of them. There's a couple other things as well. You do get Service Broker and SQL Server Agent now as well. So if you're looking for that familiar kind of instance experience that Azure SQL Database really doesn't give you, Managed Instance will give you that. Last but not least, Hyperscale. This is really cool. So it's a different service tier. When you go to set one of these up, you'll see it kind of hanging out, and the way they show it is kind of in the middle. Under the covers, the technology is completely different. And what it does allow us to do is kind of blast through the caps where, depending on what we just talked about, you might be capped at 4 terabytes or 8 or 1. We can get to 100 here. So it's optimized, obviously, for really large workloads. There are some HA design things you have to take into account here. There is kind of a compute node at the head. So you should provision at least 2 to have HA everywhere, but the storage has HA built in. Last but not least, all right, cloud stuff. Are you tired of it and you're wondering, like, all right, I need to increase my HA. I'm not going to get to go to the cloud anytime soon. I'm really bummed. How can I make things more highly available on-prem? SQL Server 2019 has what's on the slide, ADR. It's really cool. And so what it does, they would tell you it's instantaneous transaction rollback. You can debate that, but it's certainly much faster. So if you ever sat there waiting on an always-on AG failover, and you're about to hit that button, but you had to cancel an overnight batch job to do it, and it took 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15, even longer. And then after the failover, it took a long time to come back. This gets rid of most of that, almost all of it. So very, very cool thing. You don't have to be in the cloud to do it. You do have to be on SQL Server 2019. So takeaways: talk within your team. Talk outside your team as well. Any especially complicated things like we just talked about, you've got to bring in networking, you've got to bring in operations, get them all involved, because this all belongs to you. Because even though the call is going to say the database is down, these, especially the more expensive setups, there's a lot of moving parts there and a lot of people involved. And you can kind of take that as you can take a leadership role there. Set expectations, both for your team on what you expect them to do and how you kind of care and feed these things, and set up with management as well, where it's like, listen, you gave us this budget, here's the goal, we can meet with that. And if that doesn't agree with their goal, then talk about the budget that takes and be very upfront. Don't promise something you can't do. And last but not least, there's no perfect answer. We talked about a lot of different scenarios and why you might want to do certain things. Nothing except for mirroring is bad. None of what I talked about, you should kind of turn your nose at it and be like, you never use that. These are all the right answer for something. So now that you've kind of been exposed to all of it, hopefully you feel like you're in a good spot to kind of make that call next time. Here are all the ways to find me. I encourage you to do so, whether it's for feedback, questions, whatever. Thanks for spending an hour of your Saturday evening with me, and that's it.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Matt. As we wrap up this session, if you have any further questions for him, please feel free to reach out to him. He's very, very approachable. So we are going to take another break, go to intermission, and after we come back, it'll be Angela Henry talking about data modeling. So like every other session, I'm going to cut it off here. We'll be back on in 30 seconds. So take a quick break, grab a snack, pick up your feet, enjoy the next session. Thank you again, Matt.
Thanks.